If I haven't been able to speak to you already, my name's Eloise Morgan. I'm responsible for producing the Power Experts Conference, and I hope to be able to speak to you all at some point today. I'd like to start by saying a huge thank you to the conference speakers who've brought together a great agenda and have been a fantastic help for the next 2 days. Our platinum sponsor today is Nalco, an eco-lab company. They've actually played a large part in bringing the show together, and Nalco will be presenting a little bit later this morning. Our gold sponsor is Great Lakes Solutions, a Chemtura business. You'll be hearing from Great Lakes around midday. Thank you to our silver sponsors, Coalbed Carbon and FuelTech, and we can look forward to FuelTech's presentation tomorrow. Our bronze sponsors are Environmental Energy Services, Southern Research Institute, Haddock, Breen, and Newman Systems Group. All of our companies are exhibiting outside of the conference area, so if you'd like to go and see them at any point today, they'll be available for you. We've got a drink reception at the end of day one, so you're all invited to come and join us. That'll be held directly outside. And if you haven't already reserved your place for tonight's dinner, then chase me down or see one of our team on the reception desk, and we can reserve your place. That will also be held in the hotel itself. And now I'd like to hand you over to our chairman of day one, Tim Eccles, chairman of Georgia Public Service Commission.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Georgia. Welcome to Atlanta. We're glad you're here. Appreciate you spending your money in our city and in our state. Well, I don't know if you're following the news. I wanted to just, before I get into my short presentation, just the lead story today in the Macon Telegraph, which is our city kind of down 75, just in the middle of our state. Georgia leads nation in power from outdated coal units. Is their lead story, and about 3 paragraphs in, they were talking about this report yesterday from the Union of Concerned Scientists, who report that Georgia has 22 coal units which produce 34.7 million megawatt hours of electricity that should be shut down, of course, or controlled, they say. And then if you couple that report with the report out of the NARU conference, where 3 of my colleagues are as they wrap up today with the Southern Company, and I think Southern's here today. Is there a representative from Southern Company here today? I think several. With the report yesterday regarding the EPA regulations, and I think I speak for all the commissioners here in Georgia, and we're all elected, all 5 of us, statewide, that we're very concerned. One, coal is the reason our energy is so cheap here in Georgia, and we're concerned about it going away. We're concerned about increasing federal regulations that essentially will drive a dagger in the heart of coal. And I personally believe that once a plant's closed, it would be very difficult to ever go back and reopen it if, God forbid, natural gas prices go way up in 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 or 50 years. So I'm concerned that we not get rid of our coal generation here in Georgia. And as we enter into our IRP process, Integrated Resource Planning process, next year, I know that this is going to be a topic that's talked about a lot. The bottom line is that good energy policy, we believe here in Georgia, attracts economic development. I was with the governor last week, Governor of Georgia, Nathan Deal, last Thursday, talking about this very topic. And we certainly have a governor that believes this, that's very focused on economic development, and our cheap energy prices is going to be a key attractor for manufacturing here in Georgia, and we've got neighboring states that have cheap energy as well, so we're all competing to get manufacturing here, more manufacturing here in Georgia. Just to give you a quick overview of Georgia Power's generation, and Georgia Power, of course, one of Southern's companies. You can see just kind of the distribution of these plants. I won't read the slide to you, but you can see their total capacity down at the bottom left part of the slide. We'll talk a little bit more about the nuclear and new nuclear and the nuclear renaissance that might have happened that I still wish would happen. We'll talk a little bit about that before I finish my presentation. This is our sources of generation in 2011, and you can see our coal generation there, centered mostly in the northern part of the state or around the central part of the state. 9 plants, 29 coal-fired units. Our emission profile, of course, we've got our own environmental regs here with our EPD under our Department of Natural Resources, but we've got, and I've been in these scrubbers when they've been down or when they're being built. We certainly have state-of-the-art emission controls on a number of our plants. But as this report yesterday has pointed out, not all of our units have this, and this is a decision that Georgia Power, along with the Commission, is going to have to make over the next number of years. Do we make this investment, or do we go ahead and convert these units? We're saving in energy efficiency programs. We're saving about 3,400 megawatts worth of power, and that's going to continue to increase. One of the things I've asked Georgia Power to do is to continue to plot all the distributed generation that we have in Georgia. So working along with a company, nonprofit called Southface. Do we have anyone from Southface here today? There is an interactive Google map where you can see most of the distributed generation that we have in Georgia. So you could go up to Athens, where I live, about 2 hours away, and you would see my home at 145 Oakmont, and it would have solar thermal, it would have the manufacturer, power partners, and the date that it was installed. So we have an interactive map where you can see all the distributed generation that we have in Georgia, or at least most of it that we can find. We need to continue to map that out. And as I've said, I want Georgia to stay ahead of any federal regulations. You may have heard today, California. I think California's cap and trade program goes into effect today, I believe. And I can say for sure, none of the commissioners in Georgia are interested in cap and trade coming to our state. And we have a legislature that's almost a supermajority Republican. So I don't think you're going to see that coming out of Georgia. I think our concern is, what if the feds 4 years, 8 years, 12 years down the line decide to impose some kind of portfolio standard? Where will Georgia be? Will we be ahead of the game? And I think by mapping out our distributed generation and knowing where all of it is, it does give us a little bit of a head start. I think we've probably got more distributed generation than we know. Of course, the implications of the environmental regulations. Yesterday, Southern said, if the news report was correct, it potentially could impact rates by 20% here in Georgia. That's alarming. It will be alarming to the legislature, to the governor, to the commission. None of us want to see our rates go up 20%. Hey, I'm elected by the people. I certainly don't want to have to answer to that everywhere I go in this state. So we want to figure out ways to keep this electricity cheap, continue to attract more development, to grow our demand because of new business, and also to increase our energy efficiency programs where we help people save. Let me just give you an example. Georgia Power has a time of use rate for residential customers called the nights and weekends rate. That's their kind of proprietary name for this. This program allows you, as a homeowner, and our family, I have a large family, a large home, I have 7 children. We use a lot of power. We decided as a family that we were going to move over to that nights and weekends rate. So we did that before summer, which means from 2 to 7 p.m., Monday through Friday, my electricity rate would jump from about 12 cents a kilowatt hour to almost 20 cents for those 5 hours every day. But all the rest of the time, under 5 cents, and that's only for summer usage, June 1st through the end of September. The entire rest of the year, I'm under 5 cents a kilowatt. And so we made that switch. Our family cut our utility bill by 23%. Now, I had to buy 2 box fans from Walmart, and I turned those ACs off at 1:59 every day. And it's a little warm in my house. But you know what I've taught my kids and I've taught my whole family is that electricity has a value. And I have helped them be better energy consumers. We need that across this state. Because when you become energy wise like this, it makes you more conscious of energy everywhere you go. In my office, when I'm visiting with people in their home, I'm constantly thinking about the consumption. Next year, as we enter into this IRP process, and by the way, this was instituted in our state in 1991, in part due to the difficulties in building Plant Vogtle Units 1 and 2 that almost bankrupted Georgia Power, to tell you the truth, in our EMCs across our state. We definitely don't want that to happen again, and I don't think it's going to happen again. We're in a much better place, and the NRC is in a much better place. So we're very excited, as you'll hear in a second, about what's happening at Plant Vogtle. But we'll start this next year, and we're going to get a lot of input from a lot of different folks. I've already had folks wanting to come testify about wind potential in Georgia, about the solar potential in Georgia. So it's going to be a robust discussion. We did decide last year, the Commission, to close our oldest 2 coal units at Plant Branch. This is kind of in the middle of the state on one of Georgia Power's lakes. And these are old units. I spent a day down there just walking around, hearing about how out of date they are and about how difficult it is to get parts for the old pulverizers that were in those units. So the Commission did vote to close the oldest 2 coal units there. There's still 2 other units operating. We'll have to decide whether we're going to close those 2 along with all those others that I mentioned. Of course, you know all about coal. We'll hear more about that today. And of course, the scrubbers. We need so much labor here in Georgia to do all that we're doing. If you go over to the Savannah River and you look at what Shaw and Westinghouse are doing at Vogtle, and then you go to the Savannah River site and you look at the Areva MOX facility that they're constructing there, and you go on over to the Summer plant in South Carolina. Every pipe fitter and welder on the East Coast must be in this Savannah River region. And if we continue to upgrade these plants, obviously there's a lot of iron work, a lot of machine work, a lot of welding that's going to be going on in the state of Georgia. And we're really trying to get our workforce ready and retrained. I mentioned the importance of solar. This is my solar unit. Those in the room who know anything about solar probably look at that and go, wait a second, your solar's in the shade. Don't you know that's not good? Well, look, when you make a campaign promise, you keep it. It doesn't really matter. So I promised to put it on my house, and I put it on my house. And I'm saving a lot of money. It cost me a lot to put it on there. My next house, our house is for sale. Hopefully we'll go under contract today as we kind of move over closer to the stable where my girls take horseback riding lessons. We're going to put PV on our next house as well as thermal. So I really think you're going to continue to see more and more distributed generation as the price of these panels come down. The nuclear renaissance, I'm kind of going to wrap up with this before we get into our first presenter. It was the renaissance maybe that could have been. Were it not for Fukushima, were it not for low gas prices and shale gas. I think I don't know that we've put the dagger in the heart of the nuclear renaissance, but I think we've put it close to the heart, and that's unfortunate because this is carbon free, and it is our cheapest baseload power along with our coal. So as Georgia and South Carolina lead the way, I think the world is watching us, and I think if we're able to come through this successfully, meaning close to being on time and on budget, and we're able to do this, I think other states, will look at this and go, hey, I think we'll try to build a couple of AP Westinghouse 1000s as well. So we're very aware, and I told the governor this, and he knows this because everybody tells him as well, because everywhere I go, people saying, we're watching you. We're watching you to see if you're going to be able to do this. And we believe that we are. 2,200 people working at this site right now. Will be up to 5,000 people working on this site. The largest construction project in Georgia, maybe the largest in the U.S. 800 full-time jobs on the old side, 1 and 2. 800 new jobs on side 3 and 4. This is the most important project in the state of Georgia right now for the next 5 years. It's critical. It's critical that Georgia be successful. Of course, the Yucca Mountain fiasco and with the president being reelected, I don't think we're going to see any movement on Yucca Mountain. We better figure out another place to put our waste. We better stop calling it waste. We better just go ahead and change our language. Let's call it material. Let's start recycling if possible. I've talked to our governor. He would be very interested in a recycling facility. Areva has a plan for a $20 billion recycling regional facility. I'd love to see that in the state of Georgia. I know South Carolina would love to have it as well. Frankly, this area between Georgia and Columbia, South Carolina, it's the Silicon Valley of new nuclear. And if we can land a recycling facility, and get the NRC to sign off on that in the next 5 or 10 or 15 years, that would be incredible. We've got 62,000 tons of waste, and I think 9 of those sites have been decommissioned. It's a complete waste of money. Unfortunately, the money's been stolen, by the way. The Congress has taken the money. We've put in over $800 million in Georgia. Don't get me started on this. And it's been taken. It hasn't been reallocated, and as a result, we are stuck with the waste that the federal government promised to pick up. And we simply have to have some movement on this. And everywhere I go, Rotary clubs that I speak at, I tell them, look, the next time you have a U.S. congressman in here speaking to you, make sure you ask them about our nuclear material, because Georgians are not only paying once through the Nuclear Waste Fund, Georgia Power is having to store that, protect it, secure it, put it in cement cask, buy fancy movers to move those casks, build fancy beds to set the cask on. Our ratepayers are paying twice, not once, for this material. No one knows that, though. No one's talking about it. We certainly should be. So during our presentations today, I would invite you to tweet any of your questions for the presenters to my Twitter account, if you're into Twitter or Facebook. If you have an iPhone, you can email or text those, and then during the time after the presentation and during our panel, we'll have your questions. If we get no one using technology in this room, if we get no one doing that, and I'm going to conclude we're all too old. We need to go recruit some young people to be a part of this industry. With that, let me introduce our first speaker. Stu Dalton is with, what was that? I'm sorry? Did somebody say amen about us being too old? That's what I thought. Stu Dalton, with EPRI, he is in their generation sector. He's a Cal Berkeley grad. I asked him if he was an ex-hippie. He didn't say he was an ex-hippie, but he said at one time he did have more hair and might be mistaken for a hippie. Mr. Dalton helped create EPRI's Coal Fleet for Tomorrow, their trademark program, and he helped develop the CO2 capture and storage work in the fossil area, as well as their solar and ocean energy products in their renewable energy program, which I know a number of folks in Georgia have an interest in that. So Stu, come and share with us, and let me get your presentation up here. And let's make sure I got one. Is this? Yeah, great. And thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Tim, and ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate the opportunity to address you this morning, and I envy you. My base rate starts at 11 cents and goes up to about 30. Now, I'm in California where we have a reverse rate of service, which means the more I use, the more I pay, and so that's to incent conservation. I just got through, I have a pool. I do have thermal heating on the pool from solar, and I just upgraded to a variable speed pump so I could save a little of that energy because it's so dang expensive. But I envy you. And I would say that I'm also, I've lost some of the hair during the course of over 40 years working not just with coal, but with all forms of energy in the power business. I've been in that business for a long time. And I started working early on with Southern, and one of my earliest projects was working on, there was a picture of a scrubber there, a very large scrubber. Well, we started with a very small scrubber back in the late 70s down at Plant Schultz, and then we worked with them on the Yates station as well when there was an earlier version of that scrubber. It's grown. The experience of the industry has grown. The ability to control emissions, as you saw in that last graph, or one of the last graphs, has grown. We've done a lot better at emission control, but things have changed. I worked on gas and oil-fired units. I worked on biomass. I've worked on coal along the way, and right now, there is quite a bit of change going on in the industry, partly because of requirements and regulations, and partly because of the markets, as was said just a minute ago. Probably obvious, but natural gas use is up, and U.S. emissions are down. I'll show you a slide on that in a minute. If you look at what's happened this year, there's some very good sites that are available. Probably some of you have taken a look at them. I'm going to show you a graphic of one of those sites in a few minutes. But another one that I was talking with Frank Pinciata here before we got started, I was talking about the traces of the fuel prices that are traced by the FERC site, the Market Overview site. I think it's under Other Fuels if you want to look it up using technology. It has a trace that shows at one point this year the average Eastern coal price in dollars per million BTU being more than the dollars per million BTU of gas. Now, that's not all coal prices everywhere, and it's certainly not specific once you've had it delivered to the site. But when you add the variable costs of operation of coal and natural gas, and you have the capability to operate both, as many do, or to buy power from both, what happened in April was unprecedented in this country. And that was natural gas matched coal in the percent of generation in the U.S. Fracking, or hydraulic fracturing, is a game changer as far as what we're seeing in the marketplace. Some companies that both have gas and coal, or gas and oil, are looking at some very different situations these days. I was at one of the largest oil fields in the U.S. That also produces gas about a month ago, Southern California. It's the old Naval Petroleum Reserve, Elk Hills. And they're looking at their options these days, and the direct quote was, "We have to produce the gas to get to the oil." They produce both in some of these areas. It's not necessarily economic, and they sell both, but where they make money is the oil right now. And if you look at what people have to do to keep the rates low in Georgia or many other areas of the country. They're looking at their ongoing price of fuels, and they're saying, I have to look at that price right now and say it's attractive, and I'm going to go with that, even if it means I have problems that the coal is piling up on the coal pile, and I may not be able to receive anymore. So fracking is definitely a game changer. People are saying now you can go down in one area and go out for a mile in each direction. That's quite a change. That changes the economics too. There may be more requirements on fracking down the road, but we see that as a game changer right now, and I'll show you some data on that that's pretty interesting. There's both competition from the regulations and competition from the fuels, and I'm going to particularly point out some that will be talked about here and in the reception area with the displays, things like CO2 and mercury and air toxic standard, or MATS. I know we, EPRI, have been working on CO2 for a long time and mercury for even longer. We've had field tests, a couple of dozen of the large-scale field tests, and I remember we started working on mercury back in the 80s to try and understand where it's coming from, where it's going, how it's partitioning, what form it's in, how you measure it continuously. There are a lot of issues facing facing the industry on all those. And generation is changing. Okay, I have gas coming in. What does that do to my system? I have renewables coming in. What does that do to my system? If you look at wind, in many cases, and you can see this in California ISO's website on a typical day, there might be 2,000 megawatts of installed wind or more, but there's not that much generated at any one time. And when it typically generates is not when the load peak is. The wind blows at night, typically. And on the hottest day of the year and the coldest day of the year, you may not have any wind at all. That's one of the reasons it's the hottest day of the year. So I can't count on it. It's non-dispatchable. What that is doing is changing that, and gas coming in is changing the needs. It used to be the base load was nuclear and coal. And now the base load, or at least the swing, might be heavily in gas, and coal is having to cycle more and more and change more and more. Okay, if you look at emission control, I ran the SO2 control program at EPRI for about 20 years. Most of that was for base load coal. Most of that, you got up to load, you lined things out, you were operating mostly at a base load operation, and you could control SO2 very accurately by the time we got through. At the beginning, we had a few problems. But by the time we were into the 90s and 2000, you've got well-controlled SO2. Now, you're looking at cycling units that never cycled before. If you look at, I just see Chairman of AEP walking in. If you look at Southern, if you look at the kind of things that are happening in the big coal-fired units today, this hasn't happened before. They're cycling, and they are well controlled for emission controls. But how do you operate these units now is becoming a bigger and bigger part of the question, and a bigger part of our R&D portfolio. Generation economics are, Generation economics are local primarily, but natural gas is a contender in many areas of the U.S. There isn't quite as much wind in some of the southeast. There isn't quite as much sun in the north central. There isn't quite as much biomass in the desert southwest. So renewables change overall, and gas isn't the same everywhere. And there aren't pipelines everywhere. But we're seeing it change many of the economics. We're also seeing the changes in natural gas and retirements from coal units changing the CO2 from the U.S. This is a graph from the EIA. I know you can't read it very well on the far right, but you can see the line shape. And this is the amount of CO2 emitted, and it runs from about 1990 to 2011. And if you look at the last 4 years or so, there has been the recession, obviously, and that's reduced growth. But also there have been things like my putting on that high-efficiency pump, you're putting on the efficiency controls. There's been both efficiency and load changes that are pretty systemic, plus there have been the retirements of coal units and gas units coming on. That combination has caused a quote from International Energy Agency, U.S. has cut carbon dioxide emissions more than any other country over the last 6 years. With a peak of 6 billion metric tons in 2007, the projection for this year is 5.2 billion, and 1990 was 5 billion. So that's the overall carbon dioxide emissions, and as you can see, the U.S. Coal CO2 emissions are the lowest in 20 years. We've seen new standards. There are certainly many different standards that we see as the key, and it's not just these two. But these are two of the things that cause concern when you start to look at new units. And I'll talk about new units later in some of our comparative economics. The CO2 standard from April 2012 for new units, about 1,000 pounds per megawatt hour. To put that in perspective, that's roughly 50% of a typical, there is no typical, but typical coal-fired unit. Some of the better units that have come on recently, AEP's Turk unit and others, are lower than the typical unit, more efficient. But there are, there's a requirement for new units of 50%, greater than 50% increase in cost that goes along with something like 40% or so reduction in CO2 per megawatt hour. Right now, Kemper County is being built with a integrated gasification combined cycle with some CO2 removal, and they're going to use that CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. That's the intent. And right now, that's one of the few power units that's being built and under construction that's going to meet that new limit. Now, that has a number of financial supports, tax, R&D grants for the work, and shared responsibility between the State Public Utilities Commission and the shareholders for the overall costs, but it's not a cheap unit. It will be extraordinarily well controlled for everything, mercury, SO2, and certainly CO2. It'll be on the order of at or less than a comparable combined cycle for the same amount of megawatts. But that presents a real cost barrier when you're competing on new units against gasification combined cycle, for instance. Mercury and air toxic standard, the MATS. Now, things have changed last week, and it's not maybe what you might first think of, the fact that OMB received from EPA this is in the press, that they received the recommendations for new units. I testified last year on R&D requirements, and one of the comments I made was on mercury in October in the House. And if you look at the emission controls that were tested, there weren't many units, and they were very specific units that that met the new standard, and they weren't over a full range of operation. So it's a question that has been out there. For gasification units and the way that those were posed for new units in the past, it might be possible to meet those requirements. You put something called a carbon canister on the concentrated gas stream, and you can remove mercury. That's an activated carbon, pre-sulfited activated carbon. With combustion, it's not quite so clear you could meet that limit for new units. Now, I'm not sure what went up to OMB. I'm not sure what will come out of the White House. I'm not sure what will be in the new version of combustion units, but for post-combustion capture of CO2 or for oxy-fuel, those two might be very difficult to meet. depending on what those new standards are. So we're very interested in seeing what those numbers are. There are a lot of people in the display area that have things that will control mercury for the current standards. And as I say, I know we've been working on it for many years. EPA has, DOE has, and now we're looking at implementation for the existing plants to reduce mercury. You saw some of the progress made to date in that earlier slide. What's going to happen with the price of natural gas? If I knew the answer to that question, I'd quit EPRI today. I'd be a consultant. I'd make a lot of money. I can't do that. I could quit EPRI, but I don't think I'd make a lot of money because I don't know any better than anybody else. This is a Federal Energy Regulatory Commission graphic, but I've added a few things. I added, down at the bottom, a comment from the Wall Street Journal story of the August 13 that says roughly $4 to $6 is the price, and I spelled it wrong, to liquefy, move, and regasify. In other words, I've got natural gas, turn it into a liquid, move it to somewhere. There's a differing price depending how far, of course, and regasify it at the other end. What's the difference? Call it 4 to 6. Okay. Price for landed natural gas. This is not the market price, which this morning was $3.77 for a million BTU of gas on the Bloomberg site. This one, projected by FERC here just a couple days ago, of $3.23. Say it's $4. Add 5. Does that make it competitive elsewhere in the world? With these prices, the answer would be yes. And Chenery in Sabine Pass, it says, I'll make that bet. I'll put in the $1 billion, whatever the price is, to reliquefy that natural gas, and I'll try and get an export license, which they did. The price in India, where they're saying they're going to send it right now, is about $11. Somebody's going to make money on some of these. Now, where will that drive U.S. gas prices? I don't know. If I knew that, I'd make a lot more money probably. But it says there are a lot of potential drivers. I have a report from last year, and we're about to publish one for this year. Unfortunately, I can't quite release that yet for a reason I'll mention in a minute. But the report from last year, there's a number here on the side. Probably can't see it from the back. But that report is a public report, and it says for average conditions, whatever those are around the country, average conditions of capital cost, fuel cost. Here's an example compared to a cost per metric ton of CO2. We don't have the regulations for that, but if there were, this would be how it goes. And since there aren't, you can read it right across at 0, unless you're in California, as of today. But you can read this right across at 0 and say this would be the price. Notice the bottom number on that green band is $4 a million BTU for gas. Projected out in 2015. If I could build a combined cycle in that time frame, this would be the projected price from last year's. Next year's, or pardon me, this year's natural gas price range will run, in our estimates, 2 to 6 as opposed to $4 to $8 per million. So if you notice, the bottom line here would be sort of too high for today's natural gas price. Some people have said, for instance, CIRA have said $4 is a cap on natural gas price. Not a cap, but a point at which it will level out and there'll be some different things. We put in all-in capital costs for combined cycle here at $12.75 to $13.75 on the market, and this is the band that was calculated. We have something similar for IGCC and for pulverized fuel. Now, the fuel price doesn't vary nearly as much. That's why the band is smaller on this one. The pulverized fuel is the lower, and the IGCC is the upper cost. If I go back and forth, these are on the same scale. So you can see that it's hard to be competitive even with a $4 price looking at 2015. And you're not seeing much in the way of new coal being planned right now. Now, This spaghetti chart, or if you're a kid and played pickup sticks, it's sort of like the pickup sticks chart. They're all overlaying each other. It's a lot of information on one. These are the dispatchable technologies, ranging from a top of biomass, that's that large brown area. The biomass varies hugely around the country, the price of biomass, with IGCC and PC as the red lines that are on there angled, with a nuclear and natural gas combined cycle on there as well. Biomass, the bottom line, is close to the nuclear line. And this is all the assumptions are in our report that's available. I'll give you the number just in case you couldn't read it on that last slide. Report is 1022782. You can download it as you sit here using technology if you have internet access, just by going to EPRI.com, putting that number in, and you'll find the report. Has all the assumptions, the capital costs in there for each of these technologies, the O&M costs, et cetera, for last year. The reason I don't have this year's cost is we just ran it by our utility advisors, and they said, but you really haven't put in context the difference between dispatchable and non-dispatchable well enough. I've got them on 2 slides, but there's so many caveats on that, it's hard to sort of compare things when you can't dispatch them. But this shows you that for natural gas, for coal, for nuclear, they're in the running once you start getting up into some fairly high costs of CO2. But right now, natural gas looks pretty good. This is a different scale. This is non-dispatchable. Solar, PV, solar thermal, offshore wind, onshore wind are all on this. But you notice the lowest number on the scale is 100. Lowest number on this scale. Everything else was basically below it. So now, they have been reduced. The costs have reduced. That the solar cost, PV cost especially, have come down very significantly in the last year. And then looking out to 2025, assume with me for a moment that we have carbon capture operating. Because these slides, mostly, except for natural gas is shown in 2 versions here. The flat green bars are natural gas with carbon capture. The slanted green area is the uncontrolled natural gas. So these are examples, and basically these are all in the money for dispatchable. And then non-dispatchable, these have come down somewhat, but they're probably come down even more in this current version. And just in conclusion, I guess I'd say I've worked in emission controls and coal most of my career. Right now, we see there are a number of options, but we don't have a crystal ball. Natural gas has great prices now. Where's it going? We had a warm winter. We have fracking. They're getting better at it. There is storage of natural gas, and it's varying somewhat, and there's looking forward to LNG exports. We have coal with a number of requirements and regulations on it, not just MATS, CSAPR, which will be talked about later, and CO2, but also issues on solids and on water. It's hard for existing coal. We're losing some of that fleet, but what about new? Very hard. Wind, size improves with, and the cost improves with size. Production tax credit looks like it's failing at this point. Birds, bats can get injured by wind. TV interference, that's actually an issue on the Great Plains, upper Great Plains, where they've had to buy satellites hookups for people that have wind interference from the blades going through. And neighborhood concerns. I've got a farm that makes money from it. I don't. Guess which one's happier with wind? Solar, PV, the costs are coming down, still high. Nuclear power, we'll see how Vogtle goes forward. We're very interested in that. Full disclosure, The largest part of EPRI's R&D research is in nuclear power, but we have all the generation sources to look at. The existing sites are favored, but what will the cost for build-out be? And everybody's looking right now. And just as a comment, I'm a chemical engineer by training. I get to work in Washington a lot. Policy trumps finance, which trumps technology. I wish it weren't so, but that's the way it works. So, thank you.
Seat right here. I like that last quote. Policy trumps finance, which trumps technology. Y'all write that down. It's good. All right, let's bring up our next speaker, and our third speaker is en route, I believe, from the airport, and we may juggle our schedule slightly based on Mr. Morris's. Mr. Morris, are you? Oh, great. Okay, good. Thanks. That takes care of that. So we'll bring up our next speaker. I'll make sure I've got the presentation here. Is this right? Great. Ken Nemeth has been with the Southern States Energy Board for 40 years. That's an incredible career. And by the way, the thing was created the year I was born, 1960. I was born right around the corner at Crawford Long Hospital here. It's created by Southern States. Ken has a degree from Florida State. He lives in the Atlanta area. And the Southern States Energy Board is a nonprofit interstate compact organization with a mission to enhance economic development and the quality of life in the South. I'm all about that, through innovations in energy and environmental policies, programs, and technologies. And if you're unfamiliar with how the organization works, there's a member from each state legislature, both the House and the Senate, that are a part of this. They're appointed by the Speaker of the House, and in Georgia's case, the Lieutenant Governor, who's the President of our Senate. So join me in welcoming Ken.
Thanks so much, Tim, and it's really great to be here this morning with all of you, and especially great to see Mike Morris again. It's been a while, but good to see you again, Mr. Chairman. I'm very pleased to be able to be a part of this today. This is a very busy time of the year for us, and I think we've had some very interesting observations so far from our first two speakers. And Tim, I want to thank you not only for the introduction, but for the role that you play as chairman of the Georgia Public Service Commission. You're doing a wonderful job, and we're in a very difficult situation right now with so many things on your plate. So as I begin, I want to just say that I'm going to talk about a number of things. Try to do that quickly in the next few minutes. First, tell you a little bit about us, and then talk a little bit about what carbon capture, utilization, and storage is about, some of the large-scale demonstrations and demonstration projects that deal with both carbon capture, utilization, and storage, and carbon capture and storage, which are very different. Some of the targets and some of our U.S. CO2 activities related to enhanced oil recovery, which is a major theme now, particularly for plants that produce CO2. And we're dealing today with a subject about emissions reduction and emissions reduction technologies. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about coalbed methane, and then also some emissions reduction and geologic storage resources. As Tim mentioned, the Southern States Energy Board was formed by the Southern governors in 1960. governors and legislators are members, 16 states, 2 territories across the South. You can see on the map here where the board exists. There is a federal representative who is appointed by the President of the United States under the compact. And the board's mission is to enhance economic development and the quality of life in the South through innovations in energy and environmental programs, policies, and technologies. I think one of the important facts that we need to be looking at, especially today after the election recently, is that we live in an era of energy abundance, but our national policy on energy has been to ration lately and not to develop. I always think of this when I visit the Congress, as I do more often, much more often than I used to, and that is basically there are 3 phases of public policy, which we hope we don't see between now and the end of the year. And that is, that'll never work, that's too expensive, and I was for it all along. And we think we probably will see more of that. But right now we have no policy environment that will allow energy in this country to grow. For example, the load growth for AEP in 11 states in our southern region is 0 right now. And that's really astonishing when we see that we live in such an era of energy abundance. We have tight oil in North Dakota, but we're sending it by rail to Texas and Louisiana because we don't have the infrastructure. 94% of our economy runs on oil. 85% of our outer continental shelf is closed to production. Will we build the Keystone Pipeline? Who knows what will happen in that regard. But we have had a focus on Mideast oil. We have had a focus on what we can do about oil. Oil has been a big issue for us. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the revolution in this country, the changes that are coming about when it comes to oil and the things that are being done and that can be done by us with respect to changing face there. We have about 250 years of coal resource availability, but our policy is to export it. Why invest in it? Well, you know, just a month ago, 53,000 people from 38 countries came together at the MineExpo show in Las Vegas to talk about mining equipment, mining safety, and all of the issues related to that. 53,000 people, unbelievable. In an era when people talk about, oh, coal, well, you know, coal's going down the tubes, oh gosh, what are we going to do about it? Well, there are some differences out there than we used to see. The rule of law, for instance, today, well, it used to provide certainty for investments, so that if you were in the business, you could invest because you knew what the situation was going to be. But today, we have the Environmental Protection Agency moving away from the rule of law. And so we have no longer clear standards. We now have guidance. We love that guidance. It comes all the time, which is basically de facto law. Permits are redacted. Investors are going to oversee markets. Here's a policy. Let's send our coal to China, and then let's have them make some products, and then let's have them ship the products back to us, and we buy the products that they make from the resources that we send over there. Well, we are truly a banana republic, which of course everyone knows is build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. And so we kind of like that policy, and we've used that policy. our environmental regulations really should be all about health benefits. And we should measure their cost to the economy in ways that we don't do today. But we really need to do that. We've got a big boom now in natural gas, as Stu mentioned, 200 years supply. The only question is how volatile will the prices be. Would you rather sell natural gas in the United States for $3.80, or would you rather sell it in Germany for $14? Well, I mean, if you're in the business, you know the answer to that one. So we'll see what happens. We'll see if states can retain their primacy in regulating horizontal drilling and fracturing. And I'll just say one thing about that, my favorite phrase, which is, we learn from history that we do not learn from history. And so we will see how all of this comes to pass. So what is carbon capture, utilization, and storage? Carbon dioxide produced by the combustion of coal or other hydrocarbons by electric generating facilities, industrial plants in the atmosphere, and is a greenhouse gas. Capturing technologies can be used. We've found at large point sources to separate and compress the CO2 and then prepare it for transportation. And then we can utilize it for enhanced oil recovery, enhanced gas recovery, enhanced coalbed methane recovery. We can feed it to algae and reproduce half of that algae every day, and then turn that into biofuels. We can use it as a feedstock for producing chemicals. There's about 12 things we can do with CO2. And I always say it's the biggest industry no one knows anything about. Nobody talks about it very much, but it's out there. And we produce an awful lot of it. And when we figure out more how to do things with it, we're going to be able to utilize it. And then, of course, there's storage in either geologic formations or in terrestrial plants or in soil. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Even beneath the ocean floor, we have a study coming out at Southern States Energy Board, which deals with offshore depleted oil and gas wells and the opportunity for storage there as well. And so you can see here from this cartoon that it's easy to show the integration of CO2 utilization and storage. And then in addition to that, sending this off, injecting it, bringing up the oil, producing the oil, sending it to market, and at the same time recycling the CO2. I'll talk a little bit more about that as I move through this as well. We have a number of issues in the new political landscape that are going to hit us right between the eyes in terms of CCUS and the Congress, with the Section 45Q carbon sequestration tax credit that Senator Rockefeller has continued to advocate last year and has given indication he'll be introducing some legislation in the 113th Congress. But we see that if budget sequestration is triggered, coal R&D funding will be reduced, just like a lot of other things. We fall off that fiscal cliff. EPA regulation of CO2 is likely to tighten up, and we'll probably see some underground injection control guidance that will be finalized for transition from Class 2 to Class 6 wells, which we are very concerned about because of the increased costs of Class 6. But it's good to know that CCS and coal technology development is likely to continue in the new Department of Energy budget. So we can look back at CCUS and see how this developed and just what happened to put us where we are now. Back in 2009, we had pending carbon legislation. Oil was much reduced at $50 to $60 a barrel. We had high natural gas, and there was a high cost for CO2 capture. But we look at today, we see the differences with no carbon legislation, even though, as Tim accurately mentioned, Cap and trade is a reality in California as of this morning, so we'll see where all that goes. Oil is now 80 to 100. In fact, I think it was 86 yesterday. The low cost of natural gas from shale and the continued outputs from shale. We like to think about the Bakken in North Dakota as a great example of what's happened in this country to expand the use of natural gas and expand shale. But then we have the Mississippian now in Oklahoma and Nebraska and Kansas. And we're finding out that it's about 20% of the costs of developing the Bakken. So there's some real opportunities out there. And of course, we have to drive down CO2 capture costs, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing in that regard. There are large-scale demonstrations of fully integrated carbon capture, utilization, and storage and CCS projects, some through the regional carbon sequestration partnerships that were formed by the U.S. Department of Energy. But we also have a whole bunch of commercial projects, and I'll talk more about these too. North America, the U.S. and Canada particularly, China and Europe. The regional carbon sequestration projects were developed by the Department of Energy for wide-scale deployment of infrastructure for sequestration. The Southern States Energy Board manages CCARB, which is you see in the blue here, which is in 13 states. We alone have over 350 stakeholders that have been part of our project. And so when you see here 7 partnerships, 400 organizations, there's a lot more than that that's involved. Our characterization phase, which began in 2003, we were looking for storage of locations and also CO2 sources, so sources and sinks in that phase. Then our validation phase with 18 small projects, which were basically CO2 injection projects in saline formations, depleted oil, unminable coal seams, basalt. We also did one under a power plant, Plant Daniel in Escatawpa, Mississippi. And then following that, the developmental phase, which is where we are today on carbon capture and storage. And that is 9 large-scale injections, over 1 million tons each, throughout the country, commercial scale, and looking at issues such as the regulatory liability, ownership, pore space, all kinds of the legal and regulatory parameters. The yellow stars here depict those large demonstration projects that I was talking about, and the circles are the smaller demonstration projects that you can see throughout the country. The little squares are terrestrial sequestration, which is grasses and soils and trees and so forth that have also been involved in this developmental phase. Our CCARB development phase projects, 2 of them. One, the early test, which is being led by Denbury Resources at the Cranfield oil field near Natchez, Mississippi, about 25 miles outside of that. CO2 source is coming from Denbury, transportation by them, and the Gulf Coast Carbon Center at the University of Texas is doing the MVA, the monitoring, verification, and accounting work, and leading that part of it. We also have an anthropogenic test in Alabama, near Mobile, at Alabama Power's Plant Berry. And this is an integrated project where Southern Company, Mitsubishi, Kansai Industries, and our other partners formed together to build a carbon capture plant. So the carbon is captured, and it's dried, and it's sent by pipeline, and then it's stored at the Citronelle field in Alabama. we've injected 6.2 million metric tons already at our Cranfield site. We've stored about 4 million metric tons and also recycled some of that CO2 as well. This project is known for a lot of international awards for our borehole pressure and borehole temperature tests, our above zone monitoring, the VSP crosswell work that we've done and so forth. This is one of and that makes it one of the top projects in the United States right now. This gives you an idea of our anthropogenic test, how that's going on. The 25 megawatt CO2 capture unit at Plant Berry was operational in June of 2011. We built a 12-mile CO2 pipeline transporting the CO2. Then CO2 injection began in August of 2012, and we expect 100,000 to 150,000 metric tons of CO2 per year that we're going to inject into the Paluxy Formation in 2 or 3 years. And then the site will be closed unless there are some other decisions made on it in the future. We did steam optimization and parametric testing. Compressor commissioning was in August of 2011, and the pipeline was completed and commissioned in March of 2012. In our anthropogenic test, a total of 100,000 tons captured, 20,000 metric tons of CO2 has been injected and stored. And so we're already beginning to store. In fact, they're injecting and storing as I speak here with you this morning. Some of the commercial CCS and CCUS projects, and you can see this is a global effort. It's going on all over the world, primarily, of course, in North America, see across Europe, and then in China and Australia as well. So quite a bit happening. The commercial CCS, CCUS projects, if you look at the total bottom line, you can see that there are 75 worldwide that are going on, 24 in the United States, 21 in Europe, significantly 8 in our neighbor Canada, and 11 in China. So quite a bit happening in this area. Not only just identifying areas to do it, but also evaluating these projects, executing them, and making them operational. So this is an ongoing activity worldwide. You see some of the targets in the United States for anthropogenic carbon capture throughout the major basins throughout the country. And if you look at the bottom line here, you see that we've got like 84 billion tons, or 84 billion barrels, excuse me, of oil. If the price continues to stay low, that can be captured from these early movers and from this opportunity as well. U.S. CO2 EOR activity is something else I want to mention because enhanced oil recovery is now of greater interest to major oil companies throughout the country, throughout the world. We're seeing currently some 119 CO2 enhanced oil recovery projects that provide 352,000 barrels per day. Some new CO2 pipelines, the 302-mile Green pipeline by Denbury and the 226-mile Encore pipeline are expanding CO2 EOR to new fields and basins throughout the country. And then the single largest constraint that we had has been the available lack of CO2. Well, we've got coming out all kinds of power plants and industrial manufacturing, chemical facilities, all kinds of plants throughout the country. And yet it's still the lack of infrastructure to put it all together, which is being worked on now, but it's It's coming together, but it is going to take a while to do that. The financial and production benefits are considerable. When you look at these things, the National Energy Technology Laboratory document on improving domestic energy security and lowering CO2 emissions with next generation enhanced oil recovery. You see the bottom line down there, technically recoverable reserves of 137 billion barrels, economically recoverable 67 billion barrels. So quite a bit is going on here. Quite a bit can be recovered. There's the site at the bottom if you want to order this piece. Trying to get us more on a technical level today. I think that's a great idea. So linking CO2 supplies with CO2 EOR demand basically would involve moving CO2 from our east, north, central region down to the west, south, central, mid-continent in Oklahoma and east-west Texas as well. So this is what it would take. This is how it would work regionally. A number of states are passing laws to enable this to happen, to enable them to join up. A number of companies, we've been working on this as well with some of the states to put these laws in place so that we will be able to move CO2 throughout the country better. Another option, enhanced coalbed methane with a coal capacity of 65 to 128 gigatons of CO2 being able to be stored in coalbed methane. As we know, CO2 has an affinity for coal and can be stored in those formations. We have at least 500 years of storage, unminable coal seams, oil and gas fields, saline formations, lots of opportunities there to do this. I want to also mention that, of course, a portion of our work has been funded by the Department of Energy, but I want to point something out. When these partnerships started, it was 80% funded by DOE and 20% funded by industry. Today, CCARB, our Southeast Regional Carbon Sequestration Partnership, is 62% funded by industry and 38% funded by DOE. So there's a lot of industry interest here. A lot of this has turned around, and we can see a lot more of this going forward. And I'll just close with this. The optimist, the pessimist, and the realist were contemplating the proverbial glass of water. And as they were contemplating it, they decided they'd go out and have a beer. So they did. When they came back, the glass was there, but there was no water in the glass. And it was signed the optimist and the opportunist. And so I think we can see from this that energy resources and balancing energy resources are really an important part of our future. And I think Stu said that very well this morning, and I just want to reiterate that. And if we do the sensible things that we need to do in this country that play to our strengths, I think we will be much better off over the next 4 years. So that I'll just close with a quote from Mae West, who said that sometimes too much of a good thing can be wonderful, and thank you for your attention this morning.
Well, thank you. I think the quote that I'll take away was, if I got this right, we learn from history that we don't learn from history. Was that it?
That we do not learn.
That we do not learn from history. Yeah, that's good. So good stuff. Thanks for finishing up on time as well. All right, first email question. What is Twitter? See me afterwards. See me afterwards. All right, let's bring let's bring Michael Morris up. Michael's resume is so long, and most of you know of Michael. So I'm not going to go through his whole resume. I just want to say welcome to Atlanta, to Georgia. Michael's the chairman of American Electric Power, past chair of the Edison Electric Institute, the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations. He has a couple degrees from Eastern Michigan, both the BA and an MA in biology. Man, I hated those courses. You must really like it. Yeah. And he's also got a law degree from Detroit College of Law. So, Michael, thanks for being here today, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. It's always fun for me to be here, Mr. Chairman, and the background is unique, to say the least. I started in this business in the environmental side of doing analytical studies on the impact of power plants and pipelines and transmission lines, and led to an unexpected career and something that's significant, at least for being here in Atlanta, particularly the home of Southern Company. My dear friend and colleague for a number of years, David Radcliffe, started out with exactly the same background. David started out, I was intending to be a high school biology teacher. David actually did that. Somehow I got lost along the way. And David has this great line. He said, I got hired at Southern Company in 1970 with the intent of finding a way to solve the issue that were coming up under the Clean Air Act. He said, I retired as chairman of Southern Company in 2011, and we're still trying to figure out exactly how to deal with the issues coming up from the Clean Air Act. What a great career David had in that regard, and he's truly honest about how he went about doing that. Like so many other speakers, it's always a fun opportunity to come and share some ideas and concepts with you all. I had an opportunity just a couple of weeks ago to be involved in some international meetings, and it's intriguing to me, and I'm sure to you as well, that no matter what country you're in, the challenges are almost identical. When you speak to people from the German utilities, they're worried about how are we going to prematurely retire our nuclear fleet and then turn around and buy nuclear output from the French, and how are we not going to add additional coal generation to our fleet to maintain the demand of the German industrial cycle, while all the time trying to be inside of the European Union's commitment and the German political leadership's commitment to reduce their footprint. The Japanese are in absolutely the same dilemma as they look at the whole issue of post-Fukushima, with 2 of 41 stations online and a new government speaking in terms of what they might do about it. You hear it throughout the Eastern European countries, you hear it in the South American countries. It really is a time of concern in the world over how we're going to continue to handle the, without question, continued electrification of the worldwide economy. I don't think there's any question about the impact that our product has on the ability of humankind to advance a society. When you think about replacing animal power with human power, with electrical power, you free up the opportunity to do many other things. And we know death rates go down, birth rates go up, the economies improve, opportunity to learn improves. Bright young children in the backwoods of any country or the open deserts of any country have an opportunity to learn and add value in the intellectual capacity of the globe to tackle these problems. So it's just intriguing to know that worldwide these issues that have been talked about technically by 2 very bright colleagues of mine are in fact real, going on worldwide. For us, my topic today was to address, and I guess I hadn't really given much thought when they called, so what's topic? So I gave you the topic that's in the book. You know, how do you manage the largest coal fleet in the Western Hemisphere under the current rules and regulations? And I should have thought through, well, Mike, let me think. Now, there'll be an election in early November, and you're speaking about 4 days after that election. And don't you think that the current phraseology is probably in question? Had there been a change in the White House? Maybe so. Some could argue clearly so. Whether that's true or not is absolutely beside the point today. The issue is, where are we in the current regime, and where are we going to go? We have a new feature that comes up about every election, whether it's the first term or the second term. I'm sure you've all read in the trade press as well as the more normal media press, a way to address the fiscal cliff is to impose a carbon tax. It seems to me that William Jefferson Clinton, when he stepped in as our 42nd president, tried a BTU tax with a big thud. We've talked about carbon taxes over the last 4 years in the first term of President Obama. It got some legs as it was moving through Congress, because there's nothing that a legislator likes more than a source of revenue to misspend. And rest assured, that's exactly what they'll do. That version sounded like this. It sounded like, we will put in place a carbon tax and collect trillions of dollars from you, and then we'll give it all back to you. And as I sat there with senators of both parties and members of Congress of both parties and representatives from the White House, I thought to myself, why don't we just skip all that and let us keep the money? But at the end of the day, that failed from its own weight. And I expect that this time it may fail from its own weight as well, although there is absolute unanimity, whether you're a Democrat, a Republican, a liberal, a conservative, young, old, ethnicity immaterial, gender immaterial. We need to address the issue of what we're going to do about the financial challenge in front of our country. And one of the subsets of that financial challenge is in this room. One of the very important subsets is, how are we as an industry going to deal with the challenges that face the fleet as we look forward to the challenges of constantly going under the recognition, even though the point made earlier on about growth in the United States today on electrical consumption really capped off, maybe 1% in a couple of areas, flat in many other areas, and actually down in some areas, which is really a phenomenon that we're not used to as we look at that issue. But the cost of electricity, once we digest the volume of natural gas displacing some higher priced coal, is continuing to rise on a system-wide basis. When we add new generation to the fleet to replace that old generation, there's no question about the cost points simply being higher. And the benefit of the shale gas impact that was already discussed, and I'll talk about it somewhat at length as we go forward, will ultimately wash through the system, and the overall capital requirement to build the new facilities will come to play, as well as the whole theory of something we believe in very strongly at American Electric Power, and many other companies around this 48 conterminous states believe very strongly, and our friends in Canada as well, expanding the electrical energy delivery system at the transmission level, raising the intelligence level of the energy delivery system at the distribution level, and of course the financial impact of metering with smart meters throughout the rest of the land. That is going to cause the price of electricity to go up. We all know that renewables are an important part of the policy approach that the administration will take and that many jurisdictions have taken over the years in our 48 conterminous states. That will continue to be the case. Those of us who are free to not enjoy renewable development in states that have not put forward energy plans that demand that of us have not done it, for the obvious reason that it is not price competitive today, even with all of the subsidies that are associated with it. The original developer does really, really well. Those who buy the output have to deal with the intermittency of it and have to deal with the price points, which are substantially higher than alternate prices that are in the marketplace. So we face this issue of where's the policy going to go. I think somebody said the policy controls, the finance controls, away we go. That's absolutely accurate. We're all watching for policy points now. The President, in his acceptance speech on 7 November, talked strongly about the whole notion of what he hopes to accomplish in the second term as it pertains to energy efficiency, as it pertains to renewables, and surely as it pertains to the emissions associated with fossil fuel consumptions and utilization in this country. Notwithstanding those policy hopes and dreams, we are going to run the fleet the way that it stands today. And today, the fleet is still coal-based and natural gas-based and nuclear-based, with a small amount of of hydro and a very, very small amount of solar and wind. And those 4 pieces or 5 pieces will all play together, along with a pretty important aspect that we're all getting used to, and that's the way you and I are addressing the issue of energy efficiency and demand control. Some of the policies that the FERC has put in place over the last few years in the different RTOs to make demand response equal to supply response in an open bidding marketplace has provided some learning opportunities for all of us as we go forward. And what we in America at long last are learning is that there is reward for the whole notion of being more energy efficient, of addressing the demand side of that equation as we go. But throughout this country, we continue to add baseload generation because that's an essential component of what we need to do going forward. You know, we had a very interesting presentation 2 seconds ago about let's take our coal, let's export it to another country, have them make the product, and then re-import that product to our country. Those jobs are coming home. And when those jobs come home and the manufacturing base of this country continues to grow, as we've seen in parts of our service territory with the shale developments and steel mills actually reopening, we have demand cycles that are pretty substantial. You and I continue to buy automobiles all more energy efficient than the ones that replace them, but we continue to buy them in pretty hefty numbers. We're looking back this year at a 15 million production unit cycle for the car business. That's after a few years of 12 and 13, 14 million. And worldwide, as you know, the demand for automobile transportation will continue to expand, which will put pressure on the basic supply of the fuel source itself. Prices will have a tendency to rise over that period of time. So as we look at the fiscal cliff and the impact that it may have on the regime of policies that may develop in this country for us going forward, make no mistake that our subset of the cost cycle is going to have an impact in that regard. So let's talk about the things that we are trying to do at a company like ours, and many of you are trying to do at your companies as well. The first thing we have to do is take a look at the rational side of that fleet and listen to the regulatory impacts associated with it. And by that I simply mean, what jurisdictions are you in and what are their preferences? Those who have a longer-term view, and I would surely argue that the southeastern quadrant of the United States is the home of some of the more longer-term thinking commissions, and that's what's essential when you make long-lived, massive dollar capital investment decisions. You have to have some horizon that makes sense to you. So when you see the decision made by Southern Company to go forward with 2 units, when you see the decision made by the folks at SCANA to go forward with 2 units and nuclear power, you appreciate the decision that had to be made in the joint regulatory compact that has been tattered over the years, but is essential if we really are going to go forward and accomplish the things that we all want to do, which is to improve reliability, improve availability, and keep an eye on the price equation as we go forward. Fuel diversity is essential in that equation. So following the regulatory path, most importantly at the state level. I had this conversation yesterday for about the 500th time in my career over the last handful of years, and it went like this. So, Mike, what do you think the future of nuclear power is in the United States? And my answer to that is I think the future of nuclear power is very healthy. The existing fleet is doing well. It's running well. I've had the opportunity to be on the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations Board of Directors for a long, long time, and the statistics speak highly of the dedication that the men and women who operate those stations around the country do. We see some quirks in the business marketplace itself. So we see Dominion announce that they're going to prematurely shut down one of the smaller nuclear plants in northern Wisconsin, an impact of the shale development and the price points that are available in the marketplace. Dominion tried to sell that plant. Some handful of years ago, that would have attracted 3 or 4 bidders. This time it attracted none. So as I speak to those folks, they say, well, aren't you being encouraged by the government to do that? Isn't there something called the Loan Guarantee Program? I said, there is, but it's never functioned. I doubt that it ever will. Isn't there some momentum at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to respond to Fukushima in a positive way and that allow for the continued development? That's true, and that might happen as well. But there are only 5 states in the conterminous 48 that have enabling legislation that allow for the Commission and the applicant to put forward a plan that has stability to it. By that, I simply mean that you can make the capital investments knowing that you'll get a return of and on that capital investment as you make, because short of that state-enabling legislation and that state financial regulatory approval, you absolutely will not build a new nuclear power plant in this country. So that's why you see so many of us in other jurisdictions who are producers of nuclear power today, big believers in nuclear power as we go forward, avoiding the concept of going forward. Can you imagine going to your board of directors and saying, look, we've got this great plan, we've got a carbon footprint, we're trying to have a constructive impact on it, we need to build another 1,000 megawatt station, we think nuclear is the best answer, you can pick your number, I won't try to be too specific about this, but let's just call it $8 billion. And the first question that your finance committee chair says is, well, how will we get a return of and on the capital? And the answer is, I don't know. You wouldn't last long at that board meeting before they replaced you with some other bright young light bulb who would say that wasn't a very good idea. So the point I try to make to legislators, to governors, to everybody is, it doesn't matter. Harry Reid one time said, well, if we do this, then you guys will go forward. I would say, Senator, nuclear stations are not going to pop out of the ground with your loan guarantee program. They will attract some because the cost advantage of it is logical. But they will attract none without state support in a legislative and regulatory matter going forward. So every time you interface with folks like that, it's an open question. Regulatorily, what do we do with that? Nothing if you're not in a jurisdiction that will give you the authority to do that. Today, what most of us do with our nuclear fleets, we operate them. Why do we operate them? It is the most cost-effective megawatt hour that you can add to the system. The absolutely most cost-effective megawatt hour, because when you look at the fleet, most of it is very deeply depreciated, and therefore its current capital cost and its run of the operation capital cost are very acceptable. The other side of the equation, regulatorily, we find ourselves now clearly moving to a dispatchable plant. What's the most dispatchable plant at the price point? Once you get done with the nuclear fleet, the first thing that comes online is the combined cycle natural gas power plant. Even if it's old with a heat rate of 9, you're going to run it. At $3 gas, that's 2.7 cent power. That's a pretty good bargain for my customers, and you want to see that happen. Some years ago, we were convinced by our chief financial officer and one of our marketing fellows to buy some of these abandoned natural gas plants. And I used to tell the team, what in the world are we buying these things for? They're going to sit idle forever. I was of the mindset that we were going to be out of natural gas. I wasn't quite as wrong as Jimmy Carter was in 1970 when he said we'd be out in 2000. Bright guy, nuclear engineer, peanut farmer. What did he know about natural gas? But the fact remains, we came full cycle, and today, having about 2,700 additional megawatts of combined cycle natural gas on the American electric power system is a stroke of genius, which of course I claim credit for now. The fact remains, even without regulatory changes, we are going to dispatch at the bottom of the price curve in every day that we can. There is now an interesting phenomenon. You heard the price points for natural gas, $3.77 today. Something interesting is happening in the marketplace. Old, currently retrofitted, well-depreciated coal plants are coming back on the base load equation. And you'll probably see a lot of that through this winter heating cycle as we go forward with weather today like it is in Atlanta. Probably a lot of furnaces ran last night, puts pressure on gas. Gas prices go up, coal plants start dispatching. Pretty interesting equation. So that's what we'll continue to do. Regulatorily, going into any commission today and say, I want to build a new station is a very risky proposition, no matter what your fuel choice is. Because you need to demonstrate that notwithstanding this very, very blasé economy that we've had over the last 6 years, ever since the effects of the mortgage debacle, has had a downward pressure on the overall demand side of the equation. And coupled with the things that we're all now doing with smart meters and we're all now doing with energy efficiency. So we're kind of all on hold, and that probably makes some sense. We're all finishing up the things that were on the drawing board. Some of us are having the nerve to go forward and do that. I think you all have seen what some of the municipal utilities, which oddly enough don't have a regulatory regime like any of us, have plowed forward and built plants that are coming in at extremely high prices. I, for one, a huge proponent in combined cycle natural gas plants. Thank the Lord for the Virginia Commission and the Ohio Commission, which didn't give us the authority to build them, or I, like my good friend Jim Rogers, would be dealing with 2 plants that are grossly overrun in the cost of ultimate bringing online. Glad that's not me. But we'll follow that regulatory impact as we go forward. The other side of the regulatory impact is really what is going to come out of our friends in Washington. We have no idea. I think many of us were of the mindset, had there been a change in administration, you would have seen a slowdown of the always going forward clean air approach that the EPA would champion and that we all champion as we go forward. Today, as you know, there are about 13 bills that affect fossil fuel power production, whether they're wind-based, solid fuel-based, whether they're water-based. They're there, and they're going to come forward in a progress that I hope has a logic and a timeline to it, but it might not. We will all comply as best we can. We will all make big decisions about what to do with old plants. Those that have not been retrofitted on our system, it's been pretty clear, about 5,000 megawatts, small coal, 1950s, 1960s, vintage, but at our company, even that was supercritical. They'll probably prematurely retire. Today, there's a number out in the marketplace saying as much as 60,000 megawatts might retire across the system. That's a pretty big impact, but something I'm sure we can handle. The real issue there will be how quickly do the issues come out and what kinds of realistic timelines. We have had very serious conversations with the administrator, with the administration, with the House leadership and the Senate leadership about give this industry an extra 24 months so we can get you the exact same environmental position that you're desiring, and we can do it in a much more cost-effective, engineering-effective, human capital-effective way than trying to rush to judgment and get it all done in a very truncated period of time. You can imagine the rest of the fossil fuel fleet tripping over each other to get people to bid on projects, to bid on doing the work, to design the projects, and all of us going to market at exactly the same time. It will have a devastating effect on a rush to fix that at the end of the day simply won't be accomplished. As I've tried to say, and in fact have said without any success to the administrator, you cannot do in 24 months, which we know now takes 36 to 48 months to do. And if we're all trying to do it at the same time, 48 months probably goes on to 60 months. But we will comply, no question about it. We will shut down whatever facilities, as an industry, as a company, that need to be shut down. In the short run, we will make decisions if baseload capacity needs to be added to go forward with combined cycle gas. They're now talking about a heat rate of 6. $5 gas at a 6 heat rate makes 3.5 cent power. That's a pretty good bet going forward. You saw some of the capital prices that were put up there earlier on. What it tells us is, in the near term, that's the answer. Shale gas development, there's a couple of stories out today on the wire that say, don't believe the shale gas bonanza. Haven't had a chance to read them yet, but I'm sure they're going to say maybe this isn't as prolific as we thought. Chesapeake Energy announced today, as an effect in the eastern Ohio region that we serve, that the Utica shale isn't quite as oil-rich as they thought. All the drillers, of course, are not, they're shying away from dry gas at $3 so they can get the wet gas. You still get the dry gas $3, but you take out the strip liquids, add to your cash flows off the wellhead and the production that you get. So we'll follow the regulatory impacts. We'll react to the marketplace. We'll react to the regulatory impacts. Ours is a perfect example of a regulatory question. We go to the commission in Kentucky on our Big Sandy plant to say we can do one of two things. We can either retrofit it to be in compliance with the Clean Air Act, to be in compliance with what we think MATS will look like, and ultimately address the issue of carbon if we have to with footprint availability. And that has a cost. Or we can retire that facility, utilize that site, and replace it with some combined cycle natural gas facilities that will give us the same amount of capacity going forward at a cost. Kentucky is a unique jurisdiction. It is a coal-based state. This is a coal-based plant with lots of jobs associated with that. A Democratic governor who has been very supportive of all of the developments of coal in the state of Kentucky, very supportive of the whole notion of having those coal stations run for the near and midterm, long term. So we'll follow that regulatory map, whatever it is. The next question that we all get to then is what are the legal ramifications of complying or not complying with this kind of an endeavor? One of the biggest challenges that we all face, every one of us, is you're halfway to compliance on X when the courts finally send it back. So Casper's a perfect example of that. We all thought we knew what we had in the Bush administration. We were all moving forward to comply with those requirements. When the courts came out and said, this is crazy, that won't work. Go back at it. Administrations change, new rules come out, they're considerably different, and we all begin to plow forward and say, fine, now we know what the rules of the road are, we'll go forward and follow those. Until somebody challenged that, and now that's been done away with, and we actually are swimming in the water without any notion of what the rules and or the direction that we're required to go are. But we'll continue to do that. There are some major challenges that have yet to be decided on the whole issue of whether or not the EPA has the authority to regulate carbon, whether we can or can't. So that will find its way to the end game sooner or later. And when it does get there, we'll get some final determination from our United States Supreme Court that will tell us where we're going to go. So even when we think we have a clear path going forward, we've got to always be concerned about that overhanging legal aspect of what we do. In Arkansas, for us, with the Turk Station, an ultra-supercritical coal plant, which synced to the system last week on a test run and will come back on the system full-time in early January. Commission authority in hand from Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas, only to find out that the Arkansas Supreme Court thought that the Arkansas Commission, which was the principal commission of jurisdiction for that three-state serving plant, had violated some Arkansas rule. So for a while, we were in a $2 billion ultra-supercritical coal plant construction without any assurance of recovery of it. Thank the Lord that we finally got that resolved. But the point I'm trying to make by that sub-story is that as we march down the line of where we think we're going, there are legal challenges to all those rules on both sides. On both sides. So we'll continue to move forward and have to deal with the reality that the legal decision at the end of the day may affect the business decision that you've already made, and being flexible enough to dial down or dial forward is a critical part of what we do as we go forward. The last part of what I wanted to touch on, so that I can stay inside of my 5-minute window here, is the whole notion of the technological solutions. Now, our southern friends from SCARB did an excellent job of taking you through the whole notion of what's out there in a very wide scale. What I intended to touch on in this small subset was simply to say, we know from what we did at our Mountaineer Station in West Virginia, you can capture carbon, you can store carbon, and a couple of things happen. You segregate it, you turn it into a liquid, you store it underground, it stays where you put it. We all knew that that would happen from natural gas storage and oil storage. It's a pretty easy concept to really comprehend, even though difficult for us to convince the public that it's safe. It is something that ultimately we now know can be done. What we also learned was it's expensive. We also learned that it's parasitic. We thought that we could get the parasitic effect on a 1,000-megawatt plant. You'd take about 100 megawatts to run the carbon capture machine. We never got close to a 10% impact. It was always with a 2 on the handle. Yet, that technology would continue to go forward and would continue to prove efficient as we go forward, because when we started the SOx and NOx regime, they too had a 12, 14, 15% impact. At the end of the day, with plant modifications that were made, the parasitic effect was almost unmeasurable as we went forward with technological advances. We also know that the intermittency of wind and sun can be handled not simply with just the natural gas plant sitting next to it, but with other technology. So we're starting to see in the marketplace natural gas machines, if that's your answer, that ramp up immediately to serious megawatt availability and come back down just as rapidly so that you can handle it. I always say, just as I said earlier on in the taxing, rather than collect it and give it back to me, why don't we skip it? I do tell my regulatory friends when they say, well, Mike, if you're going to build a big wind farm or a solar field, why don't you just put some natural gas fields next to it? I said, why don't we just build a couple natural gas plants and forget the rest of that stuff? That doesn't get me very far, but it's always fun to say. The fact remains, we are an incredible society. I had the opportunity in 2012 and early 13 to speak on probably 20 campuses around the country. And of course, when you're from American Electric Power, you start out at the Ohio State University. But I did go to MIT, I did go to Stanford, and many other places in between. Those students on campus are eager to help us find the answers. Those engineers that work at our company, that work at your company, are eager to find those answers. And that's going on all across the world. The technology will continue to get better. We will crack the egg on energy storage today at American Electric Power. We've got some pretty interesting battery technology things going on. We're doing flywheels and every other imaginable way to store electricity. The old-fashioned way of put water uphill at night or force air down during the nighttime and bring it back as a peaker during the day still works perfectly. So the technological solutions are either at hand or will continue to develop and be at hand. At the end of the day, I don't know how that glass of water got empty, but I am an optimist about the human capacity for us to tackle these issues. I'm not quite as optimistic about the political will to do anything that makes any sense in Washington. Thanks for your time.
Well, just in keeping with my quotation of our speaker, this speaker actually had two memorable quotes. One of them was good, and one of them, I'll let you see what you think about the possible unmemorable quote. He said, as he looked at the panel, two very bright colleagues. Did you catch that? So
I know these guys. I was speaking from fact.
I'm feeling a little insecure here. That's okay. And then definitely the memorable quote, which I tweeted out while we were sitting here, by the way. Nothing a legislator likes more than a source of revenue to misspend. That's wonderful. Well, we're going to take a 30-minute coffee break, and then I'll ask our panel to come back up, and I'll be sitting here during the break. If you want to bring me your question, I'll synthesize those questions. And we did have one other person email during the presentation. Email question, what is Facebook? And I'll have you come up and talk with me afterwards as well. So let's take a 30-minute break, and we'll be back in here for some Q&A. Thank you.
Facebook is something you should not have invested in.